There are images in history that don't need explanation, but demand remembrance. These are not just colorized photographs, they're haunting echoes of humanity's collapse. Each frame is a window into something we struggle to comprehend, but must never dare to forget. No edits, no filters, just a brutal, unflinching reality. This is Auschwitz, seen not through textbooks or distant documentaries, but through the eyes of those who were there, stripped of names, hope, and almost everything except the faint, flickering will to survive. These 15 scenes capture the unbearable silence that still lingers in the soil, the air, and the faces that remain behind barbed wire. Number 15. A child carried out of the barracks. There's no dignity in survival when your bones show through your skin, but that child lifted gently by Soviet hands was still breathing. After years of starvation and exposure to relentless horror, this young survivor was discovered in one of Auschwitz's barracks during the camp's liberation in January 1945. The rescuers didn't rush, they moved like they were carrying something sacred because they were just skin stretched over suffering. That child's body told every truth the Nazis tried to erase. Their bones were a protest, a testimony, a whisper louder than a scream. That moment, frozen in color, strips away all abstraction. There's no room for disbelief when a child becomes the evidence. Not a symbol, not an idea, just a person the world nearly forgot. And in that quiet rescue you see more than tragedy. You see endurance that refused to die. Auschwitz didn't win. That child, barely alive, was still a body that made it past the gate, alive enough to be carried, seen, and saved. Number 14. The line that walked toward death. There's a kind of silence in this image that's louder than chaos. The line isn't chaotic. It's too quiet. A group of Jewish prisoners walking in single file headed toward what they were told were showers. The phrase disinfection was a cruel lie, a false kindness masking a final betrayal. This was Auschwitz's theater of death, and these people were its unwilling cast. Many still believed they were going to be cleaned before being processed for labor. But there was no labor waiting. Only gas. Only ass. In those last steps, some even held on to their loved ones, unaware those would be the final touches exchanged. That's the violence of this photo. It isn't the brutality you expect, it's the deception, the quiet, the sense that dignity was being stolen with every step. Auschwitz didn't just kill. It manipulated the final moments of life so cruelly. Many victims died thinking they were still safe. This photo captures the cost of that illusion. Number 13. Frozen for science. Well, you don't expect to see a man submerged in ice water inside a scientific tank until you realize science had nothing to do with it. This wasn't research. This was torture with a lab coat on. A Jewish prisoner, stripped and plunged into freezing water, became an unwilling experiment, part of the Nazis' attempt to study hypothermia at Dachau. The goal? Well, it was simple: to figure out how long German soldiers could survive in cold environments. The subject? Human lives are treated like lab rats. This man wasn't sick, wasn't a criminal, wasn't even a soldier, just Jewish. That was his so-called qualification. There was no anesthesia, no safety net, no consent, only timers and silence. He stayed in that water for as long as they wanted him to, often until death. In this photo, what you see isn't medicine, it's madness. The calculated kind. The kind that wore a uniform, held a clipboard, and called itself necessary. This was cruelty dressed in logic, and it left behind corpses colder than the water they drowned in. Number 12. The children who never knew why. You look at their faces and wonder what they were told. Maybe they were told they were going somewhere new. Maybe someone tried to lie and say it would be better, but they were too young to know what deportation meant. In this colorized photograph, a group of Jewish children from an orphanage inside the ghetto are being loaded onto trucks. Destination: Chelmno extermination camp. What awaited them there were mobile gas chambers, vehicles that looked normal from the outside but were deathly sealed behind steel doors. These kids weren't even old enough to be scared properly. Some still had toys, some were still holding hands. And none of them would live long enough to understand why. They were orphans, which meant they had already lost something. And then the world decided to take the rest. This isn't history through politics or statistics. It's history through the eyes of children who never had a chance to ask what they'd done wrong. Number 11. Ashes that used to breathe. You don't look at this photo and see remains. You see obliteration. A big pile of human ashes was uncovered at the Majdanek concentration camp, so much of it that it had to be collected with shovels. This wasn't a metaphor. These were bodies' entire lives burned down into a weightless gray powder. What's jarring isn't just the sight of it, but the quantity. This is not the ashes from a single cremation. This was industrial. This was mass murder you could physically hold in your hands. Each scoop contained names that no longer existed, stories that ended in silence, families turned into smoke. The Nazis didn't just burn people, they erased them. At Majdanek alone, over 78,000 people were killed, most of them Jewish. The Allies found this pile. It was waiting for them like a statement. This was what the final solution looked like once the gas cleared. A mountain of human dust, unmourned and unburied, stares back at a world that arrived too late. Number 10. A goodbye through steel bars. It's the kind of goodbye no one should have to give pressed up against a prison gate, knowing it's the last. Behind the metal bars at the Warsaw Ghetto's central prison, a child reaches out to relatives on the other side. This wasn't a holding cell, it was a departure lounge for death. The Nazis called it the Grossaktion, a horrifying euphemism for the systematic deportation that began in September 1942. Over the course of just 1 week, more than 15,000 people, the sick, the old, and especially the children, were ripped from their homes and forced onto trains bound for the Chelmno extermination camp. This moment captures one family, frozen between touch and loss, trying to hold on to something before it disappears behind smoke. The child on the inside was too small to grasp the weight of what was happening. The adults outside were too helpless to stop it. What they shared in those seconds was all they had left. No one on either side would see the other again. Number 9. A tank of ice for the human body. It's hard to imagine what it feels like to be submerged in freezing water with no way out. For this prisoner, it wasn't about endurance or training. It was an order. Nazi doctors at concentration camps didn't ask for volunteers. They chose victims. This man was part of the hypothermia experiments conducted in the name of military efficiency. The goal was twisted to see how long a human body could survive in near-frozen conditions and whether resuscitation methods could be used on German soldiers. They didn't use mannequins or simulations. They used living, breathing people, naked, isolated, left in icy tanks as researchers watched and documented every reaction. The man in this image wasn't a patient, he was an experiment with a pulse. Many didn't survive, those who did never fully recovered. In the face of scientific coldness, literal and metaphorical, this body endured torment that still defies comprehension. No one was meant to leave that water alive, and most didn't. Number 8. A lineup meant to break the soul. There's a particular kind of cruelty in making someone salute the very system trying to kill them. In this photo, prisoners at a concentration camp stand in rigid formation between 1942 and 1944, not for honor, not for recognition, but to be counted, controlled, and humiliated. Each morning they were forced into roll call, rain, snow, sickness. It didn't matter. They stood, weakened from hunger and fatigue, saluting the symbols that had reduced them to numbers on uniforms. The salute wasn't optional, it was mandatory obedience, a final twist of psychological violence. To defy it meant beatings or worse. This ritual wasn't about order, it was about dominance. A daily reminder that their time, their breath, even their posture belonged to someone else. In this image, the prisoners aren't just standing. They're being forced to participate in their own oppression, lined up like broken soldiers in a war they never enlisted in. Their resistance was in surviving the insult, in outlasting the hands that counted them. Number 7. Shaved, lined up, and stripped of name. What you're seeing isn't just a line of women, it's the process of being erased. This photo captures women at Auschwitz-Birkenau, selected as fit for labor, walking in a line with shaved heads, bare scalps exposed to the cold air, and watching eyes. The Nazis didn't need their names. They had numbers. They didn't care about identities. They wanted function. Shaving their heads wasn't for hygiene, it was humiliation. A symbolic stripping of dignity, femininity, and humanity. Each step these women took was measured not by hope but by exhaustion. Their usefulness was the only thing keeping them alive. But even then, survival came with a price. The labor was backbreaking, the food barely edible, and the cruelty constant. These were women forced into a system that measured their worth by their ability to endure suffering. And still, they walked. Not because they had faith in the end, but because survival itself became a form of resistance. Every step forward is a quiet refusal to disappear. Number 6. A baby handed, over at Westerbork. The transfer wasn't gentle, it wasn't safe, and it wasn't going anywhere but in one direction. In this haunting moment, a baby is being handed to a Nazi officer at the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands between 1943 and 1944. No names are exchanged. There's no record of comfort, just a cold handoff under the eyes of a regime that decided some lives didn't matter. Westerbork wasn't a final destination. It was a sorting point, a way station to death. Families were split. Children, even infants, were separated from their parents and packed onto trains bound for Auschwitz or Sobibor. The Nazis didn't see children as innocent. They saw them as clutter in their monstrous vision of racial purity. This child, too young to crawl or cry out against what was happening, became just another line on a list, a name soon erased. The hands that held them didn't offer safety, only transition. No one should ever be handed over like that. But it happened, and it's captured here, in brutal, undeniable clarity. Number 5. Brothers smiling before the silence. Two boys, arms closed, smiling like they still believed in the world, Israel and Zelig. Their photograph wasn't meant to be a farewell, but it became one, captured just before the Nazi regime claimed their lives. This image is unbearable because it's still so full of life. The crime, being born Jewish. Under the Nazi system, that was enough. It didn't matter that they were children. It didn't matter that their eyes held hope. What mattered was the propaganda, the poisonous lie of racial purity, the same lie that sentenced these brothers to death. They weren't given a chance to grow old, to rebel, to love, or to even ask why. Their image was frozen in time, but their lives were snuffed out shortly after. This isn't just a photograph. It's a doorway into what was lost. Not just two boys, but two futures. Two entire stories cut short by hatred wrapped in policy. Their smiles linger, but the silence that follows is deafening. Number 4. Measuring an ear to justify murder. There's no science here, just cruelty dressed as curiosity. A Nazi racial hygienist places a measuring device against a man's ear, not for hearing, not for health, but to determine racial ancestry. This wasn't medicine. It was an obsession. A twisted project to prove superiority using arbitrary, meaningless measurements. Ear width, nose length, eye spacing. These were the tools they used to decide who lived, who was enslaved, and who would be sent to die. It's laughable if it weren't so horrifying. People were labeled and exterminated based on caliper readings and fake charts. This image, disturbingly calm, shows the banality of the evil at work. There's no knife, no gun, just an instrument pretending to be neutral, held by a man convinced that geometry could define humanity. Behind this device, there were entire families condemned to disappear, not for crimes but for cheekbones. What's chilling is how ordinary it all looks, like a checkup. But this wasn't healthy. It was hate pretending to be data. Number Dritta faces studied. Lives dismissed. The woman in this photo isn't posing. She's being dissected without a blade. Nazi scientists at the Berlin Institute for Racial Hygiene didn't need a scalpel to dehumanize. They used tape measures and notebooks. Here, her facial features are under scrutiny. The bridge of her nose, the shape of her lips, the curve of her jaw, all analyzed to feed a delusion that identity could be reduced to angles. The Nazis labeled people based on arbitrary racial traits, attempting to build a hierarchy of humanity using flawed pseudoscience. This woman wasn't a participant. She was a subject, evaluated without consent for a conclusion already written. These were not objective studies. They were justifications for murder. This image captures not just the violation of privacy but of personhood. Her expression is subdued, but behind it is something fierce. The silent awareness that she's being recorded by a system designed to erase her. These weren't studies. They were preludes to persecution, masked in measurements. Number 2. Growth charts for genocide. You don't usually think of posters as weapons, but here, a Nazi exhibition banner titled "The Biology of Growth" shows the stages of the so-called Nordic race. It looks clinical, educational even. But it wasn't about education, it was indoctrination. Propaganda dressed up as science to poison the public mind with ideas of superiority. The Nazis didn't just spread hate through soldiers and laws, they spread it through schoolrooms, museums, and charts like this. They taught children to believe that some humans were better by nature, more evolved, more deserving, and that others, Jews, Roma, Slavs, were polluting the gene pool. These posters weren't just displays, they were ideological ammunition. Every arrow and label justified the camps, the sterilizations, the murders. This image isn't just of a display, it's of a weaponized idea. An idea dressed up in neutral fonts and diagrams but designed to kill. The quietest lies repeated enough turn into permission for violence. And here's the proof: propaganda that led to piles of bodies. Number 1. Marching toward nothing but death. This photo doesn't need an explanation. Just a long look at a column of prisoners moving through the snow, leaving one horror behind only to meet another. It's a death march, ordered by the Nazis as Allied forces advanced. From Dora Mittelbau and other camps, thousands of emaciated prisoners were forced to march south, barefoot, starving, and barely clothed. The destination didn't matter, most wouldn't make it. Those who slowed down were shot on the spot. Others collapsed and died from exhaustion, buried under snow, or left by the road. This wasn't an evacuation, it was erasure, an attempt to hide the evidence by killing what remained. The march wasn't silent, but it felt that way. The world watched too late. These weren't soldiers. These were victims driven past the edge of human endurance. There are no screams in this image, just the brutal geometry of suffering stretched into the distance, one body after another, walking toward a place where death wasn't waiting, it was marching alongside them. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.